Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jack, and in this video, I attempted to survive 100 days in the post-apocalyptic survival game, The Long Dark. Since this game isn't very well known, even though it should be because it's incredible, I'll break it down for you. The Long Dark is a first-person survival game. Your plane crashes in the Canadian wilderness during a geomagnetic storm, and you're left alone in the post-apocalyptic aftermath of the disaster. Survival is your only goal, and death is your only end. You can play in progressively more intense difficulties as a voyager, stalker, or interloper, and be at risk of being attacked by hungry packs of wolves or territorial bears at any moment. Or, if you're a coward like me and don't enjoy being continuously jump scared, you can play as a pilgrim, allowing you to explore freely while being at peace with all the scary creatures. In this mode, animals will only attack if provoked, and you can focus more on the world around you rather than constantly looking over your shoulder. The mechanics aim for realism, and keeping an eye on your stats is crucial to survival. Everything counts in the beginning, but even as you progress and become more confident, you can never let yourself get too comfortable, because Mother Nature can be cruel and unforgiving. If you die, that's it. You don't get second chances, and that world is lost forever. So, without further ado, here is my survival story. I chose to spawn in a random location to keep it fair. Some regions are very harsh with little supplies and frigid temperatures, while others are bursting with loot and warm shelters, and I obviously would have gone for the second option, so it seemed better to just let the game decide. When I spawned in, I took stock of my supplies, but I really didn't have a lot. It was negative 18 degrees Celsius outside. That temperature wasn't great, so I knew shelter would be the biggest priority on my list. Aside from that, I assumed I'd need to figure out which region I was in just by looking around, but when I opened my map, I realized it told me where I was. I had been dropped into the Forlorn Muskeg, which is not the best place to start. It's a frigid open marshland bisected by a lone railway, pummeled by intense winds and dotted with patches of scarily weak ice. Barely any shelters, not much supplies, and a whole lot of predators, but it would have to do. I saw what looked like a possible shelter in the distance, as well as some birds circling in the sky, which I knew meant something dead was nearby. It was midday, so I had a decent amount of time to try to find somewhere to wait out the night, but I knew if I couldn't find somewhere, I likely would not survive the cold. I collected some mushrooms and lichen, which could be used for tea and bandages, and then walked towards the birds. Below them was a corpse, which is always jarring. They had no items on them, but I collected the crow feathers laying in the snow because every tiny thing counts in the beginning. I found a deer carcass beneath another flock of birds, but I couldn't harvest it without tools, which really sucked. I did find some rose hips that could also be made into tea though. The more I wandered around, the more desolate the area looked, and I decided that while finding shelter was critical, getting out of this region might be more important. I collected some cattails, which was good because I could eat them as a raw food source, unlike the other resources I'd collected, which would need to be cooked. I had to be super careful crossing the ice as I headed towards the shelter I'd spotted earlier, which turned out to be a train derailment. In what was deemed the poacher's camp, I found a hacksaw, which was amazing because I finally had a tool to break things down, which meant I could make fires and harvest meat. I sorted through my clothes and the other items I looted, spotted my first wolf, and then ate some of the cattail stalks. Even though it was really risky, I made the decision to try to make it out of the region before nightfall, despite being cold and exhausted already and not knowing which direction to head in. I elected to follow the train tracks, hoping they'd lead somewhere, and spotted a bear while doing so, which would have been a lot more terrifying if I was in imminent danger of being attacked. I was right in my assumption, and the tracks did thankfully lead me out of the Forlorn Muskeg. I walked into the tunnel and arrived in a much safer region, Mystery Lake. The temperature was minus 10 Celsius and it was early evening. The first thing I saw was another corpse, but they had a knife, which was amazing. Finding that was absolutely a game changer, as I could use it for harvesting meat, breaking down repairing clothes, self-defense, and so much more. After that, my plan was to follow the tracks until I found something, which did not take long. I came across another derailment, and I was going to head for that, until I saw the power lines above me turn to the right and discovered a cabin instead. My first proper shelter. As I explored the interior, I found a ton of supplies, one of which was a whetstone, which was super important because without it, I wouldn't be able to repair most of my tools as they broke down. I tried the radio, even though I knew it was pointless because of all the electricity being a no-go thanks to the geomagnetic storm, but I found a note left behind from another survivor. It was beautifully written and really made me feel like I could see what they saw, feel what they felt, and I wondered what happened to them, if they were there when the storm hit or not. I sorted through all of my supplies, broke down some items of clothing to repair other ones, and then finally went to sleep. One day down. On day 2, I woke up at the crack of dawn, but it was freezing when I went outside and looked like it could turn into a blizzard, so I stayed in for a little bit and read the book I had found to pass time. When I went back outside after an hour, I was very glad I had stayed home longer because it had turned into a blistering, windy blizzard down to negative 31 degrees. So even though it was important for me to go out and get more supplies, it looked like I'd be trapped inside the cabin until the storm passed, which meant more reading. Even after a few hours, the conditions were still extremely rough outside, but a little bit later it sounded like it had calmed down, so I went out again and the weather was much more doable. I'd be getting a bit of a late start on exploring, but it was definitely better than being stuck inside the whole day. I did want to check out the train I'd seen the previous day, but I noticed a little fishing hut close by, so I decided to go there first. I would have liked to fish for some food, but I only had the single line I had found, not a hook, so that would have to wait until I got back to the workbench in the cabin where I could craft a hook. With the weather starting to clear up, I could see way more around me, so I got brave and ventured out further. It did start to snow again, but I continued over to the cluster of cabins I'd spotted anyway because I figured I'd be safe enough there if it were to storm again. I checked out the first cabin, and when I went back out, it definitely seemed like there was going to be a whiteout. I went into the second cabin and decided to eat what would go bad first, so I had some cold tomato soup. I expected it to be a full whiteout when I went out again, but it had surprisingly cleared up. Luck was on our side, it seemed. Some more adventuring it was, just carefully, as my energy levels were dropping and my bag was very full. I found another corpse. It was really beginning to feel like I truly was the only person left alive in the world. I found a hatchet, one of the most important tools you can have in this place, and I also came across my favorite drink, Stacy's Grape Soda, an ode to the legend Stacy Plays. I found another note, this one much less hopeful and lighthearted than the last. I tried not to internalize it. That was not going to be me. I was determined to survive. My bag was getting really heavy, and I was too tired to make it all the way back to the main cabin before dark, but I also wanted to light a fire and melt down some snow, so I made the risky move of going to the nearby fishing hut to do so, since neither of the cabins near me had stoves. I found yet another corpse, but they had nothing on them. I changed my mind about melting down snow right then because I realized it would only make my bag so much heavier, so instead I decided to hunker down and do some reading and clothing repairs. It was kind of creepy seeing that corpse every time I looked out of the doorway, but it was also a reminder to be careful and watchful. I went to bed after watching a beautiful sunset, which felt like a promise of better days ahead. But only a few hours into sleeping, I was woken up by eerie sounds, and when I stepped outside, I was greeted with a sky full of neon lights, an aurora. It looked so breathtaking, I just wanted to stand outside and look at it all night, but I decided to pick up my bedroll and run to the nearby cabin to see if the radio or any electronics would work. The lights in the cabin were flickering, and the radio was definitely on, but I couldn't hear any speaking or music, so I ended up just going back to sleep. When I woke up on day 3, the aurora had passed, but it was still dark, so I read for an hour until I was able to see enough to check out the cabin. The silence was actually eerie after the constant noise of the sky throughout the night. I drank some of my water and ate a can of dog food. Kinda nasty, but you can't be picky in these situations. I left to check out the last fishing hut before returning back to the main cabin, but it was going to be extremely slow going with how heavy my bag was. I knew I could drop things that I probably wouldn't need, but so early into my survival I wanted to grab everything I could. The smallest things could save my life. I finally arrived back in the late morning and went to sort through everything I had found. After breaking down and repairing a bunch of clothing, I still had some daylight left, so I crafted some hooks and then fishing tackles. I also stepped outside for a minute to map out the local area with a piece of charcoal I had collected from the furnace. Now that I was back home and didn't have to worry about a heavy bag, I decided to make my first fire and melt down some snow. After I had melted down a good amount to keep me going for a few days, it was time to sleep. On the morning of day 4, I sorted through some items and then decided to go fishing in the closest fishing hut. I fished into the evening and managed to catch 4 fish, which was awesome until the line broke. I was all ready to head back home, except when I finally looked up from the fishing hole and stepped outside, I realized it was a full whiteout. I was really lucky though to have picked the right direction to blindly run in, and I made it home safely before dark. I decided to start another fire to cook the fish since it was too late to do any more exploring, but I failed to start it the first time, which is frustrating. Got it the second time though. For how heavy the fish are, they didn't actually provide that many calories, but it was better than nothing. I also melted down a lot of snow for more water, and then cooked some of the herbal tea I had and prepared some of the reishi mushrooms to cook in a tea as well. I got a health boost from preventing starvation for 72 hours straight, so that was super helpful because it allowed me to carry 5 extra kilograms of items, which would be useful for the exploring I hope to do the next day. I woke up early on day 5 to sort through some items, and then it was time to explore that train wreck and whatever else I stumbled across. I found 1 corpse in the derailment and found a second outside, and next to them was a deer that I could finally harvest now that I had the proper tools. I decided to continue on afterwards since it was only midday, and I assumed I'd come across more shelter since the region seemed to be plentiful. I found another part of the train, and inside there was another book to research, a second knife, and more ammunition. I was lucky enough to find another deer carcass. Being able to find already deceased animals was so useful at this point in surviving, as sad as it was, because I didn't have any means to take down animals myself, nor did I have the materials yet to craft those means. I saw a logging road sign and decided to turn there since I was getting really cold, and I hoped there'd be shelter nearby rather than having to turn all the way back around. I was starting to worry that that wasn't the case when I caught a glimpse of what looked like a small trailer park and was able to breathe a sigh of relief. I spotted a live deer for the first time before going inside to loot the trailer, so that was cool, and then I found another poor corpse in the second trailer. I set off to risk the run back home even though I was lowish on energy because I didn't want to try exploring further with such a heavy bag. I actually nearly passed out on the way, so I had to nap out in the open a few times, which was dangerous but necessary. I also came face to face with a wolf, which scared the absolute shit out of me, and then barely made it home before finally passing out. I sorted through my bag again when I woke up on day 6 and dropped the guts and hides on the ground to let them cure. I cooked the meat I had harvested and melted some more snow while breaking down and repairing clothing, and then read the whole gunsmithing book to gain skill and pass time since it was too late to go exploring after all of that. I then somehow unintentionally drank the tiny bit of undrinkable water I had on me, and I had to drink reishi tea and a lot of water to cure the dysentery it gave me. I then needed to sleep for 10 hours to finish recovering, so it was time to go to bed. I woke up on day 7 to the sky looking like it was on fire, which was very pretty, but it was way too cold, so I went back in and rested for another hour before setting out to continue exploring. I remembered seeing what looked like an abandoned building in the forest when I first entered the region, so I went to check that out. I saw some birds circling after and followed them to yet another corpse, and then decided to trail along the corner of the region to see if I'd find anything else. I spotted some more birds and the second corpse of the day, found another research book, and then was totally turned around, which was great, so I picked a random direction with more birds and walked in it. When I crested the hill, I found a little rundown barn and a trapper's cabin on a ridge. In the barn, there was another carcass that I harvested, and beneath the cabin was a graveyard, which felt very somber. The cabin, though, was stacked beyond full of supplies, but most importantly, there was a rifle, which meant I now had a way to hunt for my own food if I ran out of places to loot, as well as defend myself if it came to that. I fumbled around with the lock on the safe until I hit the correct code, and found some good stuff in there as well. After a quick nap to regain energy, and with my bag very full, it was time to head back. Except I was very lost. I just decided to walk in a straight line in the opposite direction of the cabin in hopes it would get me back to the railroad. I found I cut down some maple saplings on the way, which are incredibly useful because I can use them to craft a bow at some point. And then looking up and finally seeing the power lines in the distance was a great feeling. I was at last back on track. I got home and organized my stuff while cooking the meat I had harvested, napped a bit so I could research a little, and then went to bed after eating. I woke up a little late on day 8 because I needed lots of sleep to catch up, and then it was time to head back to that trailer park and venture past it. I kept walking and found a corpse beneath a huge sign that pointed me up a mountain trail, and I figured it would lead to a tower I had seen on the horizon a few times, so I followed it. Sadly, it was a tower, but it had been destroyed, with a corpse sitting by an old fire pit who, like me, probably expected to find shelter. I did find a mountaineering rope though, which, while being extremely heavy, would come in handy. While checking to see if it was worth using the rope to scale down the mountain, I saw the actual intact tower on the mountain across from me, so I decided to use the rope even though it would take a lot of energy. It was worth it since it would get me closer to the tower faster. After a long walk up the mountain, I got to the tower. It had lots of ammunition, which was great, and it felt so cozy that if it wasn't so far away from everything, I would have loved to set up camp there. I did some reading and then spent the night there. It was very frigid and windy on day 9, so I stayed in and read for a bit until it calmed down enough for me to head home. It was a quicker walk than I expected, and I spent the rest of the evening reading and organizing until I went to bed. On day 10, I headed out to the southern river access and found another mountaineering rope that had been left over the edge of a cliff, which I decided to come back to later so I wouldn't use up all my energy right away. I set down a snare that I had found in the trapper's cabin and hoped I wouldn't forget to come back later to check it. As adorable as the rabbits are, they'd also be a very useful source of food and materials. I found a ton of birch saplings in one place, which was super lucky. They could be used to craft a lot of things. When I rounded the corner, I found a hunter's blind and came across a wolf snacking on a freshly killed deer, and then I somehow won a standoff with it. Sorry buddy, I need those resources. The deer was barely frozen, so I was able to fully harvest and quarter it for the first time, which was kind of morbid what was left behind. The hunter's blind had a lot of useful tools in it, including an arrow, but I had to admit I was kind of disappointed to not find a bow nearby. At least the arrow was one less thing to craft later on. I almost missed it on the way back, but there was a cool open roofed cave, although there was nothing inside, sadly. As I headed back, I also found a just killed rabbit, which looked, well, I'm proud of myself for not tearing up. The amount of times I have to remind myself that it's just a game is embarrassing. Anyway, after that trauma, it was time to go back home. I dropped all the items that needed to cure, sorted through supplies, napped for a bit, and then it was time to spend the night alternating between sleeping and cooking all of the meat I'd harvested. I woke up while it was still dark on day 11, but I couldn't sleep for longer because I was fully rested, so I just ate and did some organizing to pass time. Then it was time to go back and check the snare and explore the rest of that area. I hadn't caught anything yet, so I decided to reposition it, and there was just something so wrong about staring down at those cute tiny rabbit paw prints while placing it. After that, I got extremely turned around and somehow ended up near the Carter Hydro Dam. Literally no idea how that happened, but apparently that was on the list for today. The dam is, I think, the biggest structure in the game and would not be any small task to go through, so I was unsure whether I should go in unprepared, but I was ultimately too impatient and I was already all the way over there, so I figured I might as well. As I was unloading stuff in the nearby trailer to lighten the load, I realized I didn't have a lantern on me, something I would have definitely brought if I'd been planning to go into the dam, so I decided to just tentatively enter and hope I'd find one near the entrance. If not, I'd head back home and come back when I was more prepared. During the day at least, traversing the upper floors was doable without a light, so I was already gathering a ton of items just around the entrance, and I was able to get a lot of drinkable water from the bathroom. Just as I was about to give up on finding a lantern, I found one in the furthest area of the first floor, so we were set to explore the lower layers of the dam. Going down those stairs was incredibly unnerving. I was just waiting for something to jump out at me. I did not enjoy it. I found a corpse in the lower layer of the dam, which was unsettling. I sure did not want that to be me. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in the game and forget that if you die, that's it. Once I became exhausted and it started getting dark, I made my way back up with sporadic naps, then slept for the night. I read for a few hours in the morning of day 12, so it'd be bright enough for me to see, then headed back down to the rope I found the previous day. Upon exiting the upper dam, I was greeted by the lovely sight and semi-jump scare of yet another corpse. This one looked like he did not have a good time in his last moments. From the broken arrows and the bloody bandages, it looked like he had gone out fighting, and it made me extremely nervous to round the corner. After finding nothing there, I thought I had made it to the bottom floor until I was greeted with more dreadful stares. There was an abundance of items to loot, but once I made it to the very end of the dam, it turned out the door was was snowed in, so I had to turn all the way back around with a painfully full bag and make my way upstairs to the other exit. When I finally left the dam and got outside, I had two directions I could go in. I could either follow what looked like a snowy trail, or I could creep along the side of the building. While I am very much not a heights enjoyer, that direction looked more promising, so I went that way. I cannot even describe to you how sweaty my palms were and how hard I was clenching while scaling the edge of that wall on the outside of the dam. I did not breathe except to gasp when the movement would glitch a little and make me think I was going to go flying off that ridge. When I made it to safety, I was rewarded with another deer carcass to harvest. I climbed up to the window and exited the area, expecting to be back at the surface, and instead I was brought back down to the bottom floor. I had to walk that slow path back up for a second time. I knew I wouldn't make it all the way back up before getting exhausted, so I decided to sleep in the stairwell. I woke up and made my way back outside on day 13. This time I chose to head out into the snow rather than scale the building. After a bit of walking, I found a deer carcass, but couldn't figure out a not risky way to get up to it, so I left it there. At least that's what I thought until I got so turned around that I somehow ended up on that cliff with it. And then, after harvesting it, I was stuck in a complete whiteout, which sure did not help with my sense of direction, so I decided to nap there for a bit in hopes of the whiteout clearing up. The fog was stubborn though, and I ended up having to nap until late evening, so I was getting really nervous about making it home before dark. My bag was also super full from the meat and hide, so that was going to slow me down a lot too. After wandering around aimlessly for a bit, I found a cave with a bit of supplies and figured I could stay there for the night, except I had next to no fuel to keep a fire going if it got cold enough, so I had to cut down some wood first. Once it was dark, I alternated between sleeping, cooking the meat on the fire, and harvesting arrows for materials. I let the fire burn out to see if I'd be warm enough without it, and I was, so I slept for the rest of the night. When I woke up on day 14, there was a massive windstorm, so I kept alternating between napping and checking to see if it was gone, but it seemed to want to stick around and it was cold, even in the shelter of the cave, so I decided to make another fire. The storm finally began to calm down later in the morning, and despite it still being pretty cold, I decided to head out so I wouldn't be stuck in the cave for another night. I kept hitting dead ends, and the only other option was to leave the region, which I wasn't ready to do, so as much as I hated the idea, I realized I'd have to turn back around and go all the way through the dam yet again, which meant clenching my way across the edge of the building for a second time. When I finally got back to the rope, I was too encumbered to climb, so I had to leave some stuff behind and make multiple trips to bring it back up. It drained my energy like crazy, but it was almost nighttime anyway, so it wasn't that big of a deal. Returning back to the front of the dam was a beautiful feeling, finally free of the repetitive trips up and down. I gathered some of the stuff I left in the locker and took it back to the trailer with me to stay there for the night. In the morning on day 15, I read for a little bit, and then it was time for the long, freezing cold, heavy-bagged walk back home. It felt like such a relief when that bright Canadian flag peeked over the snowbanks. I organized all my stuff, then decided to spend the day crafting things at the workbench, so that when I did decide to move on to the next region, I wouldn't have to either carry heavy hides with me or waste them by leaving them behind. First up was a bow, which took 5 hours and required 1 cured maple sapling and 2 cured guts. Then it was time for arrow shafts, which I could then turn into arrows. It got too dark to continue, so I went to sleep, but then I woke up in the middle of the night to another aurora and decided to use its temporary light to finish crafting before going back to sleep. There were 2 more places I wanted to check out before leaving the region. One was the trail behind the cabin, and the other the area next to where I left the rabbit snare, so I decided to knock both things out at once on day 16. On the trail, I found a corpse with a gun next to it, which I did not expect at all. Guns are pretty rare, and now I had 3, so that was sick. When I kept going, the trail ended with another cave overhang type of thing with a small bit of supplies. Upon arriving back at the southern access, my snare was totally ruined. I'm not sure if that was from me leaving it out there for so long, or if a rabbit had managed to escape from it, but it wasn't too big of a deal. The ropes were the bigger concern, anyway. I napped for an hour under the rope to regain some stamina because climbing up takes a lot. It took way more than I expected though, so at the bottom of the next rope I had to nap again. My heart was pounding going up that second rope, seeing the exhaustion set in so fast because I actually came so close to dying then. If I had passed out while on the rope, I would have fallen a long way down, maybe too far to recover from, so that ledge I was able to rest on saved me. I used an emergency stim to get the rest of the way up, and that did some wacky shit to my vision and heart rate, but it got me to a cave where I could nap for a bit next to a corpse. I saw some birds in the distance and found a deer carcass, harvested that, looked out at what had been my home for the past 2 weeks, and went back to the cave to spend the night. I woke up on day 17 to a beautiful sunrise and read for a bit, and then it was time to head back to the cabin. The next couple of days would be the last I'd spend there, as it was time to move on to a new region. I wanted to craft more things so I wouldn't be wasting materials leaving them behind, so I decided to work on some deerskin boots until it was too dark and I had to go to sleep. I finished making the boots on the morning of day 18, and then it was time to choose what I'd leave behind and what I'd take with me, which is one of my least favorite things to do because I'm always so paranoid about not packing enough. But speed would also be important as the trip would be long, so I had to take that into account and try to pack light. After agonizing over what to bring, it was time to rest up for the big travel day ahead. I left before first light and said my last goodbyes to my cozy cabin on day 19, and then it was onwards in the direction of the dam, following the railroad tracks. Instead of going in the dam this time, I kept going past it until I left Mystery Lake and then entered the Raven Falls railway line and followed a ravine. There was a massive train derailment, so I decided to avoid that and go around and see where it took me. I harvested a deer carcass I found and then realized I was stuck in another whiteout, and not only that, it turned out I needed a rope to continue in that direction, so I was forced to turn back and tackle the derailment. Aside from a bit of supplies in one of the train cars, that was also a dead end, so following the river was my last option. Somehow that was another dead end too, so I headed back around to the trail I originally followed and found a corpse next to a fallen tree that I could use as a bridge. This game really enjoys inflicting my fear of heights on me, although the whiteout was strong enough that I at least couldn't see all the way to the ground. My energy was almost fully depleted, so I needed to find shelter or at least somewhere under cover to sleep before I passed out in the open. I got lucky and found a cave, and also had the rope I needed to get down from the cliff I harvested the deer on. Then it was time to alternate between napping and reading until nighttime. I slept in a bit on day 20 to regain as much energy as possible, and then it was time to backtrack now that I had the rope I needed. At first I thought I wasn't able to return using the tree bridge, but it was fine, just a bit of tricky maneuvering. After a nerve-wracking descent, I found a corpse at the bottom and a train car with an emergency flare kit. I wasn't sure what I'd need it for, but I grabbed it just in case. I found a deer carcass next to a cave where I decided to stay for the rest of the day to warm up, nap, and read since my energy was too low to keep traveling. I also needed to melt more snow because I was completely out of water, so I built a fire as well. After cooking the meat I had and melting down lots of snow, it was time to sleep. I woke up to the most aggressive storm I had seen yet on day 21, so I read for a couple of hours until it passed, packing up and continuing my journey at midday. I wasn't happy about the late start, but I didn't want to spend another night in the cave depleting my resources. I rounded the corner and left the ravine, entering the Bleak Inlet region, which I really wasn't familiar with like I was with Mystery Lake. I was greeted with the sound of a waterfall and the silhouette of some sort of structure in the distance, so I headed out in that direction, crossing over 2 more tree bridges. I decided to follow the river, but it only took me to a dead end, so I turned back around and headed in the only other direction I could. When I made it to the top of the bridge, the lookout tower I had seen that line up seemed much closer than it originally looked, so I figured my safest bet was to make my way over there. But first, a sapling to my left caught my eye, so I chopped it down and took it with me. I passed a rock while chopping it down, and I knew I'd probably have to attach a rope to it at some point, so I took a mental note of that. I made it to what was called the Pensive Lookout and looted a crate below it before heading up the stairs. The visual conditions weren't great, so I wasn't really able to survey the area, but I found the rope I'd need hanging by the door. On the floor of the lookout shack was a bearskin bedroll, which is super warm and would keep me from having to worry too much if I ever had to sleep outside of a shelter, but it was also really heavy. I decided to stay in the tower for the rest of the day and night since my energy was low and the weather was getting bad outside, so I spent the rest of my daylight reading. When I looked up from my book, there was another aurora. The computer flickering was super eerie, but it looked beautiful outside. The lights also let me see my surroundings better. There was a lit up radio tower across from me, and what looked like a bridge and a cabin in the distance, so that was where I planned to head the next day. It looked like most of the region was a vast frozen body of water, so that'd be super cool to explore. After sleeping in for a bit on day 22, it was time to head out to the cabin I had seen. When I got to the rope and deployed it, I realized I was too encumbered to climb and drank an energy drink in hopes that it would help, but it didn't, so I had to head all the way back up to the tower and drop some stuff. It was a tough decision, but I had to leave a lot of weight behind, so I left my rifle in the tower. I figured I could come back if I really needed it, but I still had my revolver and bow on me. By that point, it was midday, and my energy was less than 50%, so it was time to spend another day reading in the tower, because I didn't really feel like risking dying when I was almost a quarter of the way to 100 days. When I ran out of stuff to read, I decided to make a fire and melt some snow since I had a lot of firewood laying around anyway. I went to bed for a few hours, and when I woke up, the blizzard outside was wild. It made me very thankful to be inside the tower, and then it was back to sleep for the rest of the night. When I woke up on day 23, it was still very frigid outside. The weather in this region seemed to be a lot less forgiving than Mystery Lake, so that was something I just have to learn to cope with because it was time to trek out to that cabin. The view and the sunrise were pretty breathtaking. If I wasn't trying not to die, I would definitely get constantly distracted just trying to watch the world. The rope descent was no problem, though energy draining as usual, and I headed in the general direction I remembered seeing this structure. It was much closer than I expected, but first I went out to check out what these birds were hovering over, and it was a deer carcass that I promptly harvested. Then it was time to check out the cabin. The inside was super cute and much bigger than I thought. There was lots of clothing to loot, including this very off-putting balaclava, but hey, whatever keeps me warm, I guess. I decided to sort through the clothes and harvest and repair some while I warmed up, and yeah, that balaclava was creepy as hell, but it had good warmth stats, and that's what counted. When I stepped outside in the early evening, I could barely see in the storm, so once again, I'd be hiding away until the next day. I'd run out of books to read, so all I could really do after cooking the meat I had harvested was alternate between sleeping and passing time. I headed out early in the morning on day 24, despite it looking like a possible whiteout, because I wanted to cross the bridge and see where it took me. I planned on traveling to the open ocean, if that's what it was, and looting any structures I would possibly come across. I got the shit scared out of me by 2 deer, which was one way to wake myself up, I guess. I found an actual road, which was a wild sight after being surrounded by only forest for so long, so I decided to follow it in hopes that it would take me somewhere cool. I stumbled across a ton of cars that had been abandoned on the bridge, but I really wanted to see what was around it because I felt like if there were cars, there had to be other things around. So I rested in a truck for a bit to see if the whiteout would clear up. After a few hours, it did begin to, and the first thing I saw upon leaving the car was a bear. Aside from that, when I looked over the edge of the bridge, I saw a couple cabins, and I decided to run over there before continuing to loot all the cars. The cabins were apparently the homes of cannery workers, so I assumed there must be a cannery somewhere nearby as well. The first cabin was very decrepit and the second was boarded up, but I was able to enter the third. I found some snazzy snow pants which had great stats, so I put those on, and then I had the lovely surprise of coming face to face with the bear when I left the cabin. I think this game actually wants me to have a heart attack. I did originally plan to go back to the bridge, but I saw one a bit closer to me that looked interesting, so I figured I may as well check it out while I was near. And while it wasn't super useful, I was so glad that I did because I found a freaking lighthouse. It was broken up and pretty unlivable, but it still looked so cool and had a few useful things in it. However, I couldn't stay there for the night, so I decided it would be better to book it back to the bridge, or at the very least the cabin. I had to be careful when crossing the ice as deeper parts would begin to crack under my feet, so I had to stick to the white, shallower areas. I popped into the fishing hut on my way back and got a bit more food as well. I really loved this cabin for some reason. It was so cozy and literally my dream place to live, except maybe not during a geomagnetic apocalypse. Sadly though, I wouldn't be hanging around for long, just spending the night and then heading back to the bridge the next day. Day 25! I've survived a quarter of the challenge! I would have done something to celebrate if I wasn't still so focused on continuing to survive, but that's okay, it's the thought that counts. I continued looting the cars on the bridge and found an overturned semi with a corpse in it. When I got to the end of the bridge, I was blown away. There was what looked like a huge work site. I found out that it was called the Last Resort Cannery. It looked so sick and I was so excited to explore. There was some graffiti, my first time seeing any of that in this playthrough, and it was pretty ominous looking given the context. I again went into near cardiac arrest from 2 wolf jump scares back to back, got a couple things from a trailer, and then was just overwhelmed by the amount of things there were to check out. I wasn't sure where the heck to start, so I just went with the building closest to me, except I couldn't find a way to get in just yet, so I moved on to the next one. I could not get over how cool these buildings were. I spent so much time just looking around in awe. There was a rope in the first building, and I had to drop a bunch of stuff to climb it. Once upstairs, I found a bloody note with an ominous message from a past survivor. I could only assume what had happened to them. There was a broken window I could climb out of, and from there I dropped down onto a wrecked boat with some more cool graffiti on the deck. I wasn't actually able to go inside the hull, so instead I followed the dock and found a heavy hammer, which is super useful as I could use it to craft things in a forge if I found one. I was able to get into that first building then, and I actually felt a bit heartbroken at what I found. They must have frozen to death in each other's arms, and I'm not gonna lie, looting their corpses felt really bad. It was really unnerving watching the wolves roaming around outside, and I can only imagine how on edge I would have been if I was actually at risk of being attacked by them. Maybe if I do this again, I'll choose that difficulty mode, but I was way too scared this time. Also, I definitely did not know wolves could climb on top of cars like that, so that's pretty freaky. Scaling the scaffolding of the buildings was super sick. I think that was an awesome thing to add. I found some more graffiti, this time of a ferocious looking bear. Every time I thought I'd finished exploring, there was just more to find and look at. I discovered a locked door that required a number code to enter, which was a bummer, and according to the note left by the door, it would take a lot to retrieve it. I really wish the fog would clear up so I could see what else was around, but that didn't seem likely to happen anytime soon, so with my energy depleting, I decided to find a place to sleep. Though that did not happen before another wolf jump scare, of course. I found another poor soul next to a truck, and then went back to the building I dropped all my stuff in to set up camp for the night after watching a beautiful sunset. I woke up in the middle of the night to another aurora, and then the worst thing happened. I realized I had not been paying attention to the temperature in my excitement to explore, and I now had hypothermia and was at half health. That definitely made me panic, especially because I didn't have the supplies to make a sufficient fire. I searched desperately for wood, and it was so frustrating because I knew I'd seen plenty of it around while exploring, but I just could not for the life of me remember where. I looked everywhere and I ran through every solution in my mind. It all went downhill so fast, and as a last attempt, I tried to cut down a wooden crate for fuel, but it was too late. I actually died. I was in complete shock, I'm not gonna lie. The speed at which it happened was really a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of the game. I had fallen into a false sense of security that made me disregard my stats because I had gotten so confident over the hours I had put into this playthrough. If I had just noticed before I went to sleep that my temperature was dropping, I would have had more than enough time to collect fuel to survive the night. I could have done a lot of things differently, but it was too late. Once you're dead, that's it. There's no going back. It's actually amazing how jarring it feels to die in this game. You lose so much of what you worked for, so many hours put into it. I was so hopeful going into day 25 and so excited to explore, but by the end of the night I was a goner. It makes it worse that it was such an avoidable mistake. I could have done so many things to keep it from happening. I could have made a fire before sleeping, I could have headed back to the cabin for the night despite it being a long walk, I could have at the very least stayed in one of the cars. It's also so frustrating because prior to this, I think I've only died once or twice playing survival mode, so to die in one of my longest goes yet is just rough. Originally I considered just trashing this playthrough and not uploading it, but I realized that it's kind of the perfect example of how the Long Dark works. It sucks you in and gives you a false sense of confidence, and then suddenly everything you've worked for is gone and there's no way back. In the end, I became just another body in the sea of corpses. I hope you enjoyed this video despite the disappointing early end to it. I had a lot of fun filming it because this is literally my favorite game ever, so I hope it was fun to watch as well. If you'd like me to attempt to survive 100 days in this game again, let me know by leaving a thumbs up and a comment below. If you did enjoy this video and you'd like to see more stuff from me, I would really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button down below. No pressure at all, but it means a lot to me and helps me out a lot. All of my links are in the description, and I stream here and on Twitch if you'd like to come hang out. Until next time, have a great day, and I will hopefully see you in my next video.